We're going to move on to our next speaker, Helen McGowan, who is Project Manager for Divine Inspiration in the Diocese of Coventry. And Helen is going to be sharing a great deal of her own experience in helping us to consider the topic of understanding and sharing the story of your parish church.
Thanks very much, Dee. Some of you may have heard of Divine Inspiration, but most of you won't have. My name's Helen McGowan, and I've been working to deliver this project since 2006. And it's a project which is partly funded by English Heritage, so they pay half of my salary and my project costs, and the other half is paid for by the Diocese of Coventry, who represents Anglican places of worship in Coventry and Warwickshire. And the reason why English Heritage fund this work is because they accept and agree that places of worship in communities are important places which need special attention, not just in terms of repair and conservation, but actually in terms of keeping them for the future so that we can keep them, the interests that they carry alive. Now, how we do that, we have to be very creative. There have to be creative strategies that we use to make that happen. Because church buildings are not museums, they're living places where people worship most Sundays. In rural areas that's not always the case. But the challenge that Divine Inspiration faces is to help to support those people who are looking after those buildings, to keep them for the future. And we do that mainly through encouraging people to tell stories, but also lots of other strategies that I'll talk a little bit more about this morning. Now, the COB collectively in this whole country has 16,000 places of worship to maintain and to keep for the future. And in our diocese, we have about 220 of those. So we're actually quite a small diocese compared to places like Norwich or Lichfield, which is huge, and Oxford. And of course, lots of these buildings are open for visitors unconditionally. Anybody can walk into a church building. But unfortunately, lots of them are also closed. And there are lots of times when I go to places all over the country, and I'm a bit of a church crawler, so the first thing I will do is leap out of the car and go and look at what I think will be an interesting visit. And there's nothing more disappointing than finding that actually the church building is locked. So there's a kind of a paranoia associated with church buildings, that people have this immense burden of heritage to carry around with them. So actually the only way that they can cope with that is actually to shut the door. Now I'm not in the business of encouraging that. Part of what Divine Inspiration is about saying, let's open the doors, let's take the risk, let's invite people in and tell them what we're all about. So communication is a big part of what I do. And I thought I'd just focus for the next 20 minutes, because I can't talk about the whole of Divine Inspiration. It's impossible in 20 minutes. Dee will know this. I'm just going to focus on the power and the role of the parish church in the community in the present, and how it can hold the key to so much parish history and storytelling. Because actually the parish church is often the oldest building in its community. When you think about it, it's often the very oldest, but the least understood. And in rural parishes in particular, where the church warden might have been in post for 10, 20, 30 years, we have got church wardens who've been in post for 30 years, rather scarily, the building just becomes part of the fabric of their lives. And they see past the details that new eyes can actually be fascinated by. And of course, we have to also remember that the church belongs to the parish. It belongs to everybody. It doesn't belong, it's not a possession. It doesn't belong to particular people, named people at any time. It's actually for everybody. And that's quite a difficult concept that isn't always acknowledged by the people in charge. So I thought I would show you this little cartoon. I have to say that during the 12 years that I've been working for the Church of England, I've come to realise that the church is actually very confused about what to do with the buildings that it has in its care. We've got a handle on the conservation side, and we understand the needs of our buildings in terms of repairing them and keeping the rain out. And we're beginning to accept that we have incredibly beautiful and important heritage spaces to share with people, but we're all actually not very good at it. We're not very good at it. And it's often down to just a very small handful of people to do all of this stuff, which is a full-time job. And these are often people with jobs and children and chickens, and they've got other things in their lives, apart from this intense love that they have of their church building. And we also have to remember that a lot of people in church are just too busy with all the mission-shaped stuff, which is their priority. And the building can sometimes get sidelined and doesn't get as much attention as perhaps it deserves in some places. And as I said before, what we do know is that we shouldn't be in the business of turning these places into museum pieces. New work is allowed. Lots of buildings now are installing new facilities, undertaking reordering programmes, which is very healthy, to make them fit for purpose and hopefully give them a new lease of life to ensure that they have a sustainable future. And the Church of England is on a bit of a drive at the moment called, there's an initiative that they're promoting called Building Faith in Our Future, which you might like to explore. It has some very interesting things to say about the heritage that we have in our care and what we should do about it. And it's encouraging congregations to see their buildings as assets rather than millstones around their neck. So this is really to illustrate that while our buildings are important to congregations, they don't always understand them. And in turn, if they don't understand them, it's very difficult for them to share them. Some congregations will be really, really happy to close the doors on their church and set up churches in homes and in local school halls, and lots of churches are finding the cost of maintaining and funding a needy building. They're doing this, they're decamping to their church hall to sing their hymns and pray their prayers on a Sunday morning, and they're turning their back on their buildings. We're seeing that more and more. It's not something that we're in the business of doing intentionally. We don't make churches redundant very easily. In fact, in our diocese, I think we've only made 2 churches redundant in the past 10 years. Other dioceses are actually have more impressive or not statistics to illustrate that. What we encourage our church communities to do is to see their buildings as 7 days a week places rather than just places for Sunday. What we know is that while we encourage churches to reorder and include new facilities in their offer, that actually the domestication that we are imposing on those church spaces can be quite dangerous, in that we take out the special kind of holiness that we can offer people who come to our buildings. By turning those places into an extension of our sitting rooms, we're somehow taking out something that is unique to those buildings, and we need to be careful that we get the balance of that right. One of the things that I always begin when I start working with the church community is to get them to understand what they've got, and really encourage them basically to be history detectives, to be church history detectives. And I think if you start, it's not about dumbing down, it's really about meeting people where they are. The idea is that because people are not often really even very interested in history, we need to start at quite a low baseline. And there's a presumption somehow that just because your building is old and it's been there forever, that it somehow automatically becomes an interesting place to visit. Now, I always say, people in this room might have heard me say before, that being ancient doesn't automatically make you more interesting. I know that for a fact. I've met quite a lot of ancient people who really are quite dull. It's worth spending some time auditing the space that you've got in terms of artefacts, how the building has evolved over the centuries, getting to grips with heritage value of the building. And what we've realised is that you can do this through writing something called a statement of significance. And on the Divine Inspiration website, we've got a template that helps parish groups to write a better statement of significance, which helps them to bring together everything they need to know or should know about that church building from its very first beginnings through to the present day. Now, I've put these on here just to illustrate the fact that sometimes the things that we take for granted sometimes go unnoticed, and I don't know whether any of you recognise these images at all. No? They were in the news about 2 years ago, in 2010. And they were both painted by an artist called Quintin Netsis, who is Dutch, I think. And he painted a famous image, I think it's called...
Flemish.
Flemish, he's Flemish, that's right. Is that almost Dutch? Close. It's close. He's some of his work is shown in the National Gallery. It's all over the place actually, and he did quite a lot of sacred paintings. And this image on the left, the one on the left of Christ, was hanging in Bradford-on-Avon Parish Church in Wiltshire on a piece of board, no frame. It was just hanging on the wall, and it was found in 2010 by chance because somebody was visiting the building, doing some research into something else, happened to notice this and realised its significance. In fact, its partner, which was cut from the same board, the painting on the right of the Virgin Mary, is worth £600,000. Now, this isn't to suggest that there are lots of valuable things hanging in churches. It's just to demonstrate the fact that often things of value and significance are sitting in these places, and people it's part of the fabric of what they see every Sunday, and they ignore it. They walk by it and they don't absorb it in the way that new eyes would. They were actually looking at this masterpiece on their wall forever, and had never even bothered to research it or ask questions about it, which is quite scary. So part of my role is about encouraging people to get to grips with what they've actually got in their care, because that's the beginning. That's when you can start telling your story. Because by understanding the heritage and how the role of the church has changed in the community, you can inform, you can delight, and you can entertain. And as part of our work, we also encourage congregations to spend time identifying the kinds of people who come to the church in the first place and what brings them there, what they're looking for. And we've already spoken about it this morning. One of the big reasons for people visiting churches is family history. You know, and we all know that ancestry is big, big business, and finding out who you are is incredibly chic. Everybody's doing it, apparently. And lots of people are hungry for this kind of information. And yes, they can trot off to their records office and find out all kinds of stuff, but if you just happen to visit a place by chance and you're 40 miles away from your record office, it isn't very convenient for you to do that. And churches, as custodians of records, should be able to answer questions about registers, and so we encourage churches to either transcribe registers, which can be an onerous task if it's a large parish. It's not so onerous in smaller parishes. And we arrange for them to have digitised versions on their church websites or in hard copy in church, so that people don't have to be signposted somewhere else. They can actually do that piece of work in the context in which the event actually happened, which actually makes it more real and more alive. And we've been looking at using pew plans and graveyard plans a lot to help to turn lists, what's essentially a dull list, into something that's much more exciting, into human stories. And the Diocesan Archive, which lots of our church communities, they just don't know what is sitting in that Diocesan Archive. And that is normally in your records office also. And it can have incredible stuff in there, you know, correspondences, church ordinance-terriers, accounts. The bastardy courts were normally held in churches. So there's lots and lots of interesting stuff that is just sitting in a diocesan archive, which I think is underused, and I'm encouraging people to use that a lot more. And we've been starting to use something called the Good Graveyard Recording Pack, which is published by the Church's Conservation Trust. I've got a copy of it here today if anybody wanted to see that. But lots of our parishes are using this as a template now to actually put together to do their own graveyard survey, so that they can answer questions directly of people who visit and who make inquiries. And this actually in turn becomes a really good community project for people of all ages to work together on. So there's lots and lots of added value in all of this stuff. It's not just for history geeks. It can be for lots and lots of people who are interested in their local community in different ways. And of course you can keep that inside church. So, and these are the kinds of things that are a starting point. I've actually got a copy of an audit that a parish has carried out using the pack, so that you can see two ends of the process, and they keep the audit in church, and people can buy it if they want to. It's quite a substantial piece of work, but it's not too big that it's intimidating and it's not accessible. It's very good. They got it right. And I often talk to congregations about how they really need to understand the context of what they're about, because a visit to a church is quite different to a visit to a stately home, for example. A visit is likely to be unplanned to a church. I was just passing and I dropped in. I saw the spire and I thought, well, that looks nice. Or they might just be on a walk. So it's not quite the same. If I want to go to Charlcote, I will purposely go to Charlcote. I'll spend a whole day there. I'll take a picnic. It's a different kind of visitor experience. Visits to church actually last on average about 12 minutes, which isn't a lot. And lots of people walk into a church building, stand at the back, and if there's no tools there to encourage them to walk around in the space or information available for them, they'll just walk out again. It's actually, some people find church buildings quite difficult to understand, but also there's an emotional thing going on that people are a little bit frightened of church and the kind of messages we're giving out. Church history can often be complicated and tied up with politics. So the best way, in my experience, is to tell the story of church through a timeline, using timeline in church. What was happening in your church in 1793 when England had declared war on France? What was happening in the rest of the country? Indeed, the rest of the world. So putting history into a broader context that others will appreciate and understand is a really good start. And this is just the BBC history.co.uk history timeline that I look at quite a lot, actually. Because it will give you a really good context of what was happening globally, nationally and regionally at any given time. And there's an EH booklet called Churches and Cathedrals, I think, which has got an excellent timeline in it. I've got a copy of that with me today also if anybody wants to see it. But that's the kind of thing we're encouraging churches just to laminate and have in the back of church, so that if visitors come and they've got a question about context, they can just refer to that. Because things like being able to describe how the church building changed radically under the Reformation, for example, is really interesting. And resources like the ones I've mentioned are really helpful in creating visual timeline, which is people respond much more to visual stuff than they do to pages of writing, in my experience. That's how people learn better. A church I worked with many years ago had a paragraph in their little guidebook, and it said that the tower had taken 100 years to build. Now that was interesting, but actually the next question is, why did it take 100 years to build? When they explored that, the reason why it had taken 100 years to build is because the Black Death was prevalent over that time, and they just couldn't get the manpower. People kept dying. So it took them 100 years from start to finish to build their tower. So when we get around to really telling our story, we need to look at what the building can offer us in terms of resources and potential for that. And the impact of war on communities can be told brilliantly inside church. Themes of sacrifice, laying down one's life for one's friends, resounds with everybody. More and more people now are attending remembrance services because of the contemporary conflicts that are happening in the Middle East. And a list of names on a memorial is a massive sadness, especially in small communities where the surnames are often repeated on a memorial. Sometimes there are 4 or 5 people with the same surname, which is devastating. If that was happening now, in our time, how would we be responding to that? Those kinds of things that happen in our communities. I think we need to attach some emotional baggage to some of this. It's not just about facts and figures, it's about working out how people felt and what are our emotional responses to that. And lots of churches are using their memorials to tell stories about their communities, where whole generations were wiped out, and working out what the impact on that community was at the time. There are interesting conversations to be had about that. And there are still people around who consider the Great War and the Second World War to be recent conflicts because they had grandparents or I had a great uncle who died in the Great War, and I've been to visit where he fell. He doesn't have a grave, but he's on a memorial. And I think there's a lot of interest in that at the moment. So we need to be able to answer those questions for people who visit our churches. We have a duty of care to have that information on hand. It's a very powerful offer that we can make to people, I think. And because church is actually a safe place to explore big questions of life and death in a historical context. The children I was working with on this day here, this was a project that we did with the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment. The day that I had put together was all about encouraging the children to be a church detective. And one of the activities we did that day was to make the rubbing of a tabletop tomb in the churchyard. And yes, it was about enabling them to make a pretty picture of something that they could take home and show to their mums and dads. But actually, the tomb was chosen very carefully so that it could provoke a difficult conversation, because among several people mentioned on the inscription of this tomb is a small girl called Martha who died when she was just 10 years old, so she was the same age as these children here. And as we worked, we were chatting about this and what life may have been like for Martha and her family, the way in which losing a family member may have affected them. It was really, really powerful stuff, and actually stuff that couldn't happen in the classroom. It would be very difficult to have those kinds of conversations in the classroom. But in an historical context, in its setting, it was entirely appropriate and very powerful, and it didn't cost anything. We're encouraging lots of our churches to hold these kinds of exploring, the kinds of days where children can come and explore the site and get their hands on stuff that is old, because normally they're told not to touch stuff. No, it's not okay to do that. Don't, in church, be quiet, don't run. We're kind of stepping back a little bit from that and giving children the freedom to explore in ways that they may not have had before. This is Henry Kingsmill. Some of you might have seen him. He's in a church in our diocese. He's headless, armless, legless, and I still find him strangely alluring though. I think it's the trousers. But he perished at the Battle of Edge Hill in 1642. The Battle of Edge Hill was fought close to here, about 20 miles south, in between Kyneton and Radway. And Henry Kingsmill was a parliamentarian who perished, and he's one of the few to have a memorial placed close to the battle site. And the effigy and the tablet recording his personal story is now in St Peter's, Radway, an unassuming Victorian church that stands on the battlefield. The original church churchyard where he was buried had to be knocked down because it was dangerous, but they built a new one. And a huge portion of the battlefield is now part of the Kyneton barracks on MOD land, so you can't actually get onto it to explore it. But work carried out with St Peter's, because they are a church in danger of being closed if they don't get their act together. We carried out some work to highlight their relationship with their community, to help them to work closer with it's a small community, but also to help them to work out what their relationship is with the battle. And he's obviously a great start. And what we realised was that there's a real lack of accessible information about this particular skirmish. There's plenty of books and surveys, but the challenge lies in making that information real for people who are not very, if at all, academic, but nonetheless interested in the story. So I've started to kick them off on this project, and we're working now in strong partnership with Kyneton Local History Society, the Battlefield Trust, and Dr. Glenn Ford, who some of you might know has done extensive battlefield surveys in Bosworth, and he's also carried out one at Edge Hill. And we're now submitting an HLF grant so that we can try and create an Edge Hill battlefield hub inside the church. This is all very new. I've just literally submitted the pre-application forms this week on their behalf. This is to ensure that the story can be shared much more widely than people who just want to bowl up to the records office to look at the stuff. There's got to be a way of bringing that information into a much wider arena. So that's the challenge for us. And this is actually less about showing people battle plans and saying, oh yes, they came down the hill on a horse and they shot from here. It's more about kind of identifying how that battle affected the community. What happened to the people who struggled under those circumstances. It was very hard for them. the more research we do in terms of the personal stuff, the personal tragedies, the more interesting it is. And there are opportunities for every church to do this, in large or small ways. It says great things about stewardship, actually, that every member of every church community has a role to play in caring for the fabric, but also being a role as a custodian of its past, and that is the challenge for everybody in churches. I'd like to finish by just touching on the issue of communication. And we've talked a little bit about that in the first session, because knowledge and research has value. We all know that. But unless we can work out how to share what we know about our parishes as widely as possible, then we're only actually doing half a job. I had a very quick look through the agenda for this weekend and remain astonished at the amount of expertise and enthusiasm there is for the parish church as a primary source. But the real power in all of this is dependent upon excellent and clever communication and how we share all of that as widely as possible. Lots of churches now do have their own web pages, and we encourage that. We help people to build web pages, and I encourage them to include pages about the history of their building and their parish. Now, Wikipedia, whatever you think of it, and some people are really sniffy about Wikipedia, is a really useful tool for people who want to share their story, and it's becoming a trusted source. It's great because it's free. It's free, it's really easy to use, we use it a lot, and you can create free resources on the web, as well as enabling others to update or contribute to the page. So it's a community forum. And I don't know whether any of you are familiar with the code on the left at all. Do you know what it's called? It's called a QR code, and QR stands for quick response. You'll be seeing them all over the place. They're on the backs of newspapers, the backs of buses, on tube trains. Every time I buy anything from Sainsbury's, it's got a QR code on. I challenge you to find 5 QR codes on things before the end of the day. I generated this on the computer in 10 minutes. If you scan it, it takes you to the Divine Inspiration website with your smartphone. Technology is moving so quickly that by 2014, there will be more smartphones in this country than desktop computers. And this is the way that younger people are beginning to access, use and share information. So we have to start working out how we can meet people where they are in terms of technology. I was working recently with a group from Ilam in Staffordshire. The beautiful church is in a valley and they have no internet connection. When I challenged them about this, they said, oh, it's no good to us because we can't get on the web, we can't do it. The point is that people who will come to you can. So it's about understanding that this is how people find information where they are, and then they come and find you. And I think there's real power in this, which we're not yet using. I've got a smartphone. My dad's 74, he's got a smartphone. More and more people are getting them, and you can download a reader, QR reader, which is just like barcode scanning technology for free. So if you have a smartphone, do that later today. That's my homework. The topics that I've spoken about today are just a very, very small part of the kind of work I do. So if you'd like to explore the website further, you can scan the code before you go, or you can just simply go to the website and find out a little bit more. We've also got Holy Histories pages which we're developing on that site to encourage all churches to post a quirky story about their heritage and their history, so you might like to just look at those. I'm going to stop there, so many thanks, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the weekend.
Thank you very much indeed, Helen. You've given us a great deal there to think about. I suggest we have a couple of quick questions to Helen now, because I think that some of the things she said will also be very relevant to hopefully the last part of our discussion. So any quick responses? Go ahead.
Helen, how do you find the parish is responsive to what you do? I mean, do you have people that really just, shut the door in your face, or do you always find them welcoming you, as it were, with open arms?
It really varies. I mean, I think a lot of churches have a very clear agenda for what you might call tourism. So, for example, Dee has been doing some work that we've been involved with a little bit at Holy Trinity Stratford. Holy Trinity Stratford has a huge tourism agenda. They can't survive without tourists. Most churches don't have a tourism agenda, but all churches can have an agenda for welcoming visitors to their building. And some people, back to what I was saying about how it's important to kind of identify the kinds of people who would come. That's our starting point with churches. They do dismiss us sometimes and say, well, we don't have time for this. This is just something else to have to think about. But actually, when we encourage them to see what we're trying to encourage them to do as part of their overall ministry to visitors, it becomes very clear that it's a good idea. Because if we don't allow people to be stakeholders in those buildings, which is essentially what we're asking people to do, then those places will die. So this is about investing in the future, in a sense. And so once they've got that round their neck, they can understand that. But there are often some churches who just can't cope with the idea of, it's the golf club syndrome thing, where they just can't cope with the idea of people just wandering around unconditionally in a building that they're paranoid about anyway. Lots of people say to me, oh no, we can't open because somebody will pinch the lead, or the lead's on the roof, so don't worry about that. If they're going to, we say to people, put the valuable stuff away, put the brass away, anything metal, replace it with wood, and if that gets pinched, it's not a huge problem. The fact that there's so much potential in terms of heritage and history, and it's sometimes locked away, is a great sadness. So we work very, very hard on changing the culture.
Can I just add a very quick point to that? One of the things our centre is doing in conjunction with Helen and English Heritage and others is developing a training programme for clergy and lay leaders, PCCs, diocesan officials, which includes all the issues around maintaining, researching, interpreting churches, because there is a real need. Most clergy who are responsible for churches are amateurs. We don't put most of our historic buildings in charge of amateurs, but we do in this case. And it's not their fault, and they don't get training in it. They don't get any vision imparted for what to do. And I think there's a real role for actually
include history in that as well?
Absolutely, good. Absolutely. All of that. And also drawing in, Helen mentioned the Stratford app. Well, in our session tomorrow, we're actually going to be showing a phone app we've done for Holy Trinity Stratford, also a glimpse of one we just finished for Coventry Cathedral. And we're also going to be talking about partnership, because it seems to me we've already in this session demonstrated we have a huge resource in local historians, we have parish churches with great needs to understand their history, but that marriage is not always taking place. And it's one of the things we all need to facilitate.
I think that's one of the things that we're doing more and more of, is trying to encourage the churches to look outside of their congregations and communities for help, which is what they've done at Radway with the Edge Hill project. Actually, the Kindham History Society, without them, this project wouldn't look the way it does at the moment. So there's a kind of shared responsibility that we're encouraging, which is very healthy, I think.
You had Helen first. I think one more quick question, and then we'll take the others at the end. If that's okay.
I was interested in the graveyard surveys that you were talking about. Back in 1980, I cannot remember just how many, but it was something like 70 or 100 churchyards in the county were surveyed. Do you have access to that material?
We looked into that because lots of people said that to us and said, oh, I remember back in the day somebody went around and did all of this. And I tried to work out what had happened to it as a body of work. And most of the time what had happened was the church had been given a copy of the survey and had put it away in the safe. And they hadn't actually got it out so that people could look at it, which was the whole point of it in the first place. So we've been trying to identify the people. I mean, Berkswell did it, they were one of them. They've got it now so that people can look at it. And there are others. I don't have a comprehensive list, but that is something I can go away and tackle again if you think that would be helpful. And that's something that could go on the History Society's pages, for example.
Helen, thank you very much indeed for that. We're actually alternating.